Welcome to this presentation of the Greater Philadelphia chapter of the Association for Talent Development. This presentation, Rewiring the Brain for Peak Performance, was presented on March 2, 2016 by Dr. David Bach at the Microsoft Technology Center in Malvern, PA. Dr. David Bach is a Harvard-trained scientist and physician who is an expert on how people can enhance their day-to-day effectiveness. After a decade-long quest to maximize his physical and mental performance, he founded the Platypus Institute. His goal with the Institute is to bring scientific rigor to the rapidly growing field of human performance optimization. What if you could significantly improve the impact of your training efforts by understanding the latest evidence in how your people learn? As learning professionals, we know that human performance is both art and science. And as training leaders, we can design cognitive activities to help people expand their productivity, creativity, and memory. This session will focus on the science of what it takes to maximize learning, memory, and situational awareness, and is just as much about our own personal growth as it is about becoming more aware of how we can use science to help our learners get more done at work. And now we present Dr. David Bach.
Hmm. 14 years ago, I hit a crisis point in my life. I think the easiest way to say this is my life back then was an utter mess. I had just started my first company. It was a venture-backed company. It was going nowhere. I was really seriously out of shape. I weighed 15 pounds more than I do now, and it wasn't like muscle. And I was just miserable. And I really didn't know where to turn. Now that moment, 14 years ago, that became a turning point for me, and essentially the genesis of the Platypus Institute. And I want to take you on this journey that I took during this past 14 years. But before doing that, I'd like to also provide you a bit of context. I want to tell you about my early childhood because it's very relevant to the story. You see, I had an unusual childhood. I grew up in a family of scientists. So my father was the guy who invented bone marrow transplantation. My mom was a really famous biochemist. No pressure, right? And so the world I grew up in was the world of science and the scientific method. And then when I got older, I did what was expected of me. I became a doctor and a scientist like my dad, and so I went to Harvard Medical School and did cancer research and the like. So 14 years ago, when I hit this crisis point in my life and I didn't know where to turn, I approached that moment the only way I really knew how, which was as a scientist. And the first thing I did was I began to collect data about my brain and my body. What I was trying to do is I was just trying to figure out if I could find something, some sort of data point that correlated with how much my life sucked, or when it was working well, to try to see patterns. And then as I began to collect the data, the next thing I did is I started to see these patterns, and I actually started to do experiments on my brain and my body. Again, this is not a typical story. So, one example of an experiment I did is I spent a week sitting in a biofeedback chamber with electrodes hooked up to my brain for 14 hours every day, and I was looking at my brainwaves before, during, and after. One time I spent 3 weeks where every night I would sit down in an ice bath. That's a bathtub filled with like ice cubes and water for an hour, and then I would look at my blood chemistry like before, during, and after. So all in all, in these past 14 years, I've done 77 experiments of that sort on myself. And as you might imagine, some of those were wildly successful, and some of them were complete duds. But here's what's important. The man standing in front of you today is an unrecognizably different guy than the one you would have met 14 years ago. I'm not speaking only about my hair. By virtue of kind of testing my limits, physically, mentally, I really turned my life around. I'll start and tell you about my health. There's something you can measure called biological age, which is just you look at blood chemistry and try to figure out how old your body is. What I can report to you is that my biological age today is 4 years younger than it was 10 years ago when I started measuring it. Now, I'm going to let you do the math, but if you do the calculation correctly, you're going to figure out that in 15 years, I'm going to be 8. I turned my brain around. So I increased my IQ, my measured IQ, and more importantly, for the first time in my life, I found my way toward happiness. But perhaps most to the point, because you guys are in the business world, I rewired myself and trained myself to be effective in the business world. And after this was done, I took my company, which at the time had $7 million of revenues, and in 9 months I grew it to $130 million of revenues, exited that company and started 2 new companies, each of which rapidly grew to $100 million in size. Now understand, I'm not telling you this to impress you. Instead, my intent is to impress upon you that using science, you can engender truly radical changes in your life and your brain. Now, during these past 14 years, while I was on my own journey, there's been a revolution, as everybody out there was mentioning to me. You've all heard about it in the world of neuroscience. And the core thing which has happened is that biological imaging technology has now progressed to the point where we can look into your brain with such precision. We can actually watch thoughts as they occur. We can watch neural pathways being built. We can watch them dissolve. And with that, as you've all heard, our insight into this process I've been through, this rewiring process, has exploded, and thus our ability to truly influence our brains and bodies. And so again, I'm inviting you during this time we have together to join me on a journey into this cutting-edge rewiring science. Now, you may be thinking, I mean, I'm thrilled that you guys all came, but you may be wondering, well, what does this actually mean for me personally? What does it mean in terms of my ability to be an effective trainer? What does it mean in terms of my ability to be more effective? Well, what I'll share with you is certainly there's an enormous amount of science around how you can be more effective with an audience, and many of you are familiar with that, and we'll cover that. But let me ask you about this personally as well. What if you too could dramatically enhance your cognitive ability so you become smarter, so your creativity increases? What if you could triple the amount of energy you feel during the day so you don't get that kind of sluggish feeling? And what if you could reduce the amount of stress you experience by an enormous factor without hurting your productivity? What would that do to your life? As far-fetched as this may sound, everything I'm describing is fully achievable using the science we're going to be talking about. So again, I invite you to join me on this journey. So as we begin our journey, the first stop along the way that I'd like to take is talking about the unconscious mind. You've all heard of the unconscious mind, but unless you're a neuroscientist, you probably don't spend a lot of your time thinking about it. So the unconscious mind is the part of your mind that decides to beat your heart 100,000 times a day. Right? Most of us are not consciously thinking about our heartbeat. I mean, who here has had the thought today, I think I better beat my heart now? Right? So fortunately, you don't have to think about it. And so that's an example of a deeply embedded, unconscious neural pathway at work. And I'd ask you to consider the fact of the matter is, while you're not consciously thinking about it, your nervous system is actually, at some level, making a decision every time your heart beats. Decides to go faster when you run and so on. Most of us operate in the world as if it's our conscious mind, the thinking mind, that's running the show. The fact of the matter is, the vast majority of your decisions and actions, many of which have a huge impact on what you do, are happening well below the level of conscious awareness. In fact, when neuroscientists attempt to estimate it, what they typically will conclude is that the unconscious mind makes 40,000 times as many decisions, takes 40,000 times as many actions as your conscious mind. So it's an incredibly potent force. I'd like to ask you a question just because I want to drive this notion of the unconscious mind into your conscious awareness. Where do you see your unconscious mind at work in your day-to-day life? Maybe where you find yourself doing something, you've almost got no awareness of what you're doing or how you know how to do it. Any ideas? Yes?
Driving the car.
Driving the car. Tell us more. What do you mean when you say driving the car? Just give an example.
Autopilot. I mean, how many times do we drive the car and we don't even think about what we're doing? We show up and we're there, and how did we get there?
Right, so everyone heard that, right? You get in the car, 20 minutes later you get out, you have no memory of the drive. Can anyone here relate to that? Right. Think about this for a moment. It's a terrific example. How many unconscious decisions do you have to make over a 20-minute period if you're driving a car? I mean, it's really tens of thousands of things happening way below the level of your conscious awareness. You know, I was sitting there. I've got this rewired brain and all, so I've got really good memory. And I was thinking, I was planning out exactly what I was going to say, and I have absolutely no idea what I was going to say after doing this. So just give me a moment to try to remember where I was going to go. Because I was trying to, so funny. Okay, I know what I want to talk about. And forgive me, you see what happened is I was out there and I was just trying to make sure that I oriented it. So what I want to talk about at this point is I want to talk about the impact of the unconscious mind and how it affects rewiring. And I now remember. And what I wanted to talk about is essentially the two types of unconscious processing that you need to deal with when you deal with rewiring. The first issue that comes up when you want to rewire yourself is when you find a conflict between your conscious and your unconscious mind, essentially when they're at war with each other. I'll give you an example from the world of dieting, because it's something most all of us can relate to. I mean, the most common example of what people do when they start a new diet is they use something that I like to call the forever diet. What you do is you take something that you just love, like cookies, and you say, I'm going to eliminate this thing from my diet. For how long? Forever. Has anyone here ever tried that strategy? Right, and how'd that work out? Not so well. Because what you're doing is you're creating tension between the unconscious and the conscious mind. I'll sort of illustrate. So let's say I'm the conscious mind, and here I am, and there's the chocolate chip cookie, and I'm saying, I shouldn't have that because it's not good for me. And the only problem is over here, you've got your unconscious mind, which is 40,000 times as big, and all it's saying is like, cookie. Right, so when you do this, when you try to create tension between your conscious mind and your unconscious, which is how many times as big? 40,000 times as big. Who's going to lose? That's right. The conscious mind will lose every time. So the first lesson to be learned when you think about rewiring science is this. When you attempt to use willpower to overcome unconscious processes, you're guaranteed to fail. And yet we all understand how this gets in our way. I'll talk in a moment about the second concept around the unconscious, which is even more pervasive. But for a moment, because I want you to kind of internalize this, let me ask you to just turn to someone next to you and think for a moment, where is a situation in your life where you see this dynamic, where you see the tension between your conscious mind, which tells you to do one thing, and your conscious mind, which pulls you in another direction? So find a partner and just share for a moment. All right, thank your partner for sharing. Thank your partner for sharing. You guys are a talkative crowd, huh? A lot of conflict. All right. So I'd love to, I gather you all could relate to this idea. Wait till you hear about the second issue. I'd love to hear just an example or two of what you guys came up with, of where you find this conflict between your conscious and your unconscious and how it prevents you from being as effective as you'd like. Anyone willing to share? Yes, ma'am.
I'll go to the internet with a specific business purpose. After 30 minutes of surfing everything but, I forget what I went there for in the first place.
I've never had that experience. Everybody heard that. That's a beautiful example. Where you want to do something, your conscious mind tells you one thing, but something is triggering unconscious behavior. So we're going to talk about that. One more example. Who's got another thing to share? Yes, sir.
We talked about, particularly last night, knowing we really want to go to bed, but we can't get enough of CNN.
Right. Because you never know. The election results might have changed. Yeah. You never know. You never know, right? So these are good examples. And both of those are examples which are not subtle, right? Huge impact. The sleep loss from watching TV, the productivity loss from just getting completely lost in the internet. The numbers on both of those are incredibly scary. And actually, let me cite a study about the sleep issue because you may find it interesting. I want to talk now about the second issue that comes up with your unconscious mind. Because of course, when we're dealing with rewiring, what we're doing is we're trying to rewire those unconscious pathways. The second issue is not where you have a conflict between your conscious and your unconscious mind. The second one is unconscious behavior on your part where you have no conscious awareness that you're operating suboptimally. And here I would like to share with you 3 scientific studies just to give you some awareness of it. 10 years ago in Israel, they looked at parole judges and how they made decisions as a function of blood sugar and time of day. So it turned out, this study has now been replicated 5 times. A parole judge, what their job is they look at a prisoner and say, okay, you're out on parole or you're not. So it turned out in this study, if you went to the parole judge, first thing in the morning, they had just had breakfast, they're fresh, the likelihood of you being let out on parole was around 65%. Now let's say you go in front of that same parole judge right before lunch. They've been working for about 3.5 hours. Blood sugar's a little low. They're a bit tired. You're exactly the same person. What do you think the likelihood is that you'll be let on parole under that scenario? Yeah, it's under 10%. It's a huge impact. But here's what I want you to know. If you go up to the judges and you say, are you any different before lunch than you are after breakfast? What do they say? They say no. Let me tell you another story, which is even more scary. One of the guys we work with is a sort of world expert on sleep. And he likes to cite a study which has now been done over 100 times. What they do is they take Westerners like you guys, and they put them in a military bunker underground where the only thing you have is a bed and a toilet. And then they observe the sleep patterns. Now, before they put them in the bunker, they'll do a bunch of tests. They'll measure anything you can imagine, strength, cognitive function, response time, and so on. When you put those people in a bunker, on average, for about a month, they'll be sleeping 14 hours a night, catching up on the sleep deficit Again, this has been replicated 100 times. And then at some point, they'll pretty much average out, and usually it's around 7.5 hours of sleep. Once they average out, if you then measure these people, cognitive function will go up not a little, but massively. Response time, strength, anything you can care to measure, the change is dramatic. Okay, no big deal, you've all heard about that. Here's what's cool, or not cool. If you take those people and then start to sleep deprive them, say you don't let them sleep more than 5 hours a night. So now the next morning they've slept 5 hours and you say to them, how do you feel? They say, I feel awful. You say, how's your brain working? They say, it's just totally fuggy. I'm not going anywhere. You do the tests. It turns out they test poorer, lower strength and so on. You go a week, 5 hours a night. At the end of the week, you go to those people and you say, how do you feel? What do they say? They say, I feel great, doc. I am at the top of my game. My brain is here. I'm as strong as I've ever been. You measure them, their performance continues to decline. So what's going on here, and this represents, I believe, the most important topic that I'd like to share with you, is that you see people who are suboptimally performing who believe they're at their best. Unconscious behavior about which you have no conscious awareness. And so the biggest opportunity we have, if you want to rewire yourself, is to begin to become conscious of these unconscious patterns and change them so you begin to operate at your best. And the delta is massive. Is everyone following me so far? Okay, one more study and then we'll start to get practical about, well, what do we do about this? This is my favorite study. This is a 130-year-old study. Who here has ever heard of Frederick Taylor? Okay, so this is great. Frederick Taylor is known as the father of management science. Who here knows the famous pig iron study that he did in looking at how pig iron workers work? Anyone familiar with this? Okay, one person. This was probably the most important scientific study done in the world of management in the last century. So Frederick Taylor used to work in steel manufacturing plants. And he spent 20 years trying to figure out how you can use science to make steel workers and iron workers more effective. And the most famous study he did is he looked at people who were transporting what was called pig iron. And their job was they'd take a shovel, they pick up iron, and then they pull it over here, and then they move it down. So what he did is he looked at these pig iron workers and he said, how much pig iron can you move in a day? And on average, they were moving around 12 tons of iron per day. Now let's say you go to the pig iron worker and you say, I want you to work harder. I want you to push as hard as you can. What happens to the amount of pig iron they move? What do you guys think?
Goes down.
Goes down, of course. Because what's happening is they're pushing and pushing. By noon, their muscles are completely shot. So he goes around with a clipboard and a stopwatch, and he looks at them, and he figures out exactly what they're doing. 3 weeks later, he's increased the productivity to 48 tons a day. Right? This revolutionized the world of science. This was the origin of total quality management, of Six Sigma. Right? It was the beginning of the world of management science. But the interesting thing, and again, I want to drive this home to you, is if you go to those pig iron workers, just like the sleep-deprived guys, just like the judges, and you say, are you operating at your peak? What do they say? They say yes. They say, I am moving as much pig iron as I am humanly capable of, but it turns out that using science, you can rewire them and quadruple their effectiveness. But here's the interesting thing. This management science, which, by the way, Microsoft has done an enormous amount to move forward, doesn't actually apply to people like you. It applies to unskilled labor. Right? This is the people who are in Starbucks and Target and who are moving iron. There's a group of people who you and I represent who are called knowledge workers. No one's ever studied that, and I would ask you this. If you were to really look at these unconscious processes of which you are aware and the ones you're not aware, and ask yourself, what's the potential impact? Do you think maybe there's as much opportunity with you as there was a pig iron worker if you look at your cognitive function or your energy levels? So now let's talk about what do we do about this? Because again, if you try to use willpower to change things, you can't change it. Now, one of the things that I heard when I was talking to you guys before is it seems like the most important thing to you all is not so much your own performance, but your ability as teachers to move a room, to educate people. And so one of the ways in which you can have a massive impact on other people's effectiveness, their ability to learn, has to do with the external environment around them. We respond unconsciously to external cues. I'll give you an example, and then let's talk about some practical stuff. Who here has ever heard of the idea that if you use blue light at night, you can't sleep well? Right, so I just want to share this with you. If you're exposing yourself at night to blue light, your brain is taking in a signal which says, stay awake. And your ability to sleep is dramatically reduced. So if all you do is you put something on your computer or on your phone and you block out the blue light spectrum, which there's many apps that will do it, your sleep will improve. Similarly, if you black out your room, it'll tell the brain to go to sleep. And this is something most of us don't think about. Another thing you can do is drop the temperature in your room and you will sleep better. And so when you think about rewiring, obviously the internal stuff and rewiring the brain, we'll get to that in a moment, but the first thing to do is ask what's going on in the environment. So let's have a conversation, because it's so important to you, to ask, when you're in a classroom, what can you do? What are the drivers that are going to cause people to retain information, to be engaged? And this is particularly important to me because, I have some limitations as a speaker, so I need to do things to keep you entertained, with content issues. So what are some things that in the environment do you think have a dramatic impact on people's attention or memory? Any ideas? Climate. Perfect. So
Hot or cold?
Hot or cold. And what do you think makes you more aware?
For me, I don't like being cold. So if the room is cold, I will find a way to break into the thermostat and turn it up.
Right. Okay. But the question is not what's comfortable. The question is what causes you to learn well.
Being comfortable so I can focus on the presentation.
Yeah. So the answer is twofold. The first is, you have to be comfortable. So if we were to turn the temperature way up or way down, all you're going to be is distracted. But within the gradient of comfort, it turns out that the colder you make things, the more alert people are. Right? This doesn't come as a big surprise. I was sharing with someone earlier, David Letterman did a study where he systematically adjusted the temperature in his studio to figure out how to get the most laughs. And every day he would adjust it, and then he would look at, they would look at how attentive people were and how much laughter they were getting. And he found that he got the most laughter and the most engagement when the room was 55 degrees, which is obviously miserably uncomfortable. Another guy who's done that, if anyone knows about this, is Tony Robbins, who when he gives speeches makes the room freeze because it keeps you engaged. So one of the things I'll share with you is it's something you're completely unconscious about, but the cooler the room is, the more alert and engaged your audience is. I want to go over a few other things. Lighting has a huge impact. Remember I told you that when you go to sleep, you don't want the blue light spectrum because it keeps you awake. So of course there's an opposite side to that, and that is you want bright light in a room because the body, which is 10,000 or 20,000 years of experience to it, is trained to get tired when it gets dark, and there's this whole melatonin cycle that gets triggered by this blue light spectrum. This kind of lighting is not nearly as good as the kind of incandescent regular white bulbs, but you want bright light which looks like sunlight because it keeps people awake. Now these are unconscious triggers, and again the issue is when people are warm and tired or awake and alert, they have no idea that their brains are processing completely differently. Let's talk about some other things you can affect. One of them is blood sugar, right? Now, you guys all got food before here, but the truth is, if you take a look at it, a lot of what was driving these Israeli parole judges is that their blood sugar was dropping. And I used to look at my blood tests every hour, and I would see, my blood. If my blood sugar is like 105 or 110, I'm much more alert than if it's a 95. And both of those are considered normal. But the truth is, I found eating regularly and keeping my blood sugar high had a huge impact, and I had no awareness of it. So another thing is you want to kind of keep doing that. I have two other things to mention. One of them is, I'm sure you all know this, you really need to take a break about every 45 or 50 minutes. You want to have people get up and move their bodies. And this is such a well-demonstrated phenomenon. And then the fifth that I want to share with you is this. The more emotional engagement you have, the more brain activity you're going to have, and the more people will learn. So again, we had talked about this notion of having an impact on rewiring. The first thing is to look at the environment. Cold, light, blood sugar, timing, and emotional engagement. You make the changes, you'll find your audiences get 3 times as engaged. Okay? So now let's move on and talk about the internal. And this is kind of where my passion is. I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to share sort of what I know about this, and that's not really my core focus. What I'm really passionate about is the internal rewiring. So we talked about this idea, if your conscious mind's pulling in one direction, the unconscious is moving in another, how do you fight that battle? And the answer is, because you can't use willpower, is you actually have to go into the brain, and you have to rewire what's in there. And this is what I do my science about. And in these past 10 years, a model has emerged around how to do it, which is extraordinarily powerful. And the easiest way to remember it is an acronym, MIR. Measure, interrupt, and replace. And this is spoken a lot about in the media. When the media talks about it, it's often portrayed as a sort of process for kind of creating this half-human, half sort of sci-fi superhero like the Terminator. I'll be back. And what I'm here to tell you is that's very realistic, and in a few minutes we'll talk about some of these almost science fiction-like applications that Measure, Interrupt, and Replace is creating. But the fact of the matter is, this process of Measure, Interrupt, and Replace, it doesn't need to be complex. So 4 months ago, I had the opportunity to meet with one of the world's famous billionaires. You guys have all heard of this guy. It was at a cocktail party. It wasn't like a speech or anything. And I told him about this, and he said, David, this is cool. How can I use this to double my productivity? Right? Now, I was sort of excited about this, and I wanted to bring him back to my lab and wire him up and all that stuff. And that was all cool, except that he had a plane in 20 minutes. He said, no, I want something now, which is probably how he became a billionaire. And I have to admit, I'm a little intimidated here, and I don't get that easily intimidated. But, you talk about productivity. I mean, this guy in any, given hour is more productive than I've been in, the last 50 years of my life. And so, but I'll tell you what we came up with, because it actually turned out to work pretty well. We set him up on a program over 2 weeks where once an hour, his iPhone would go off. And I apologize because I know this is a Microsoft site, but he happened to have an iPhone. I'll talk to him about that, next time So we had it set up, and at the end of every hour when the iPhone, set off the alarm, he was instructed to do a couple things. The first one was to write down a number on a scale of 1 to 10 about how productive he thought he had been in that prior hour. And then the second one was just to write down a few notes about what he had noticed in the prior hour about being productive or not. So 3 days later, he writes me a note, kind of out of the blue, a very sweet note. And you're going to love this story. He told me that he had been dazzled by the experience. Because in 3 of the hours during those 3 days, when he tried to write down what he had done, he had the same experience as this woman. He had no memory of it. He had got completely lost in the internet. And this is not some schlub, right? This is one of the more productive people alive. And 2 weeks later, he wrote me another note, and he said, you know what? I can't believe it, but you did this. I really believe my productivity doubled as a result of this. Now, why did this work? Well, would you agree that we set him up on a program where he's going to measure and interrupt and replace? So let's talk about each of those steps. If I were to say, the phrase, you manage what you measure, have you ever heard of it? I mean, right, everyone's going to raise your hand. Right? And we all know this is true intuitively. From a neurological perspective, what's happening is when you measure something, by definition, you're engaging your conscious mind, which is the frontal part of the brain. And so with that, you're going to actually activate awareness of things which will increase the attention around a pathway. The second piece, which is really the one which is cool, measurement has been around forever. The interrupt is the new thing neurologically. I'm going to draw a brain here. So this is my brain. If this is a pathway, if you interrupt a neural pathway, effectively, what actually happens if you look at it in a brain scan is over the course of 30 days, the pathway will just dissolve, right? It's sort of like, imagining on a highway, if you put up a brick wall, kind of the cars can't get through. So you interrupted, you'll see the pathway dissolve, and the other thing that happens is that the brain will release a neurotransmitter, which is called acetylcholine, and it sends a signal to now build a new pathway. So now you're measuring something, you're interrupting a pathway, and as you think about something else, what happens is new pathways will grow. And it's really quite staggering what happens. Let me put you through an exercise, if I could. I'd like everybody to just sit up straight and put your feet flat on the ground. And when I say the word curl, what I want you to do is I want you to take your toes and I want you to curl them as tight as you can for like 30 seconds. Okay, you ready? Curl. Okay, now who here has just stopped breathing? Okay, you can uncurl your toes now. You can breathe if you'd like. That's an example of an unconscious neural pathway at work, right? We go into a stress state and we'll immediately tense up. I've done that with martial artists. I used to be a martial artist. And they'll curl their toes and they're just completely relaxed. All of these are measure, interrupt, replace things. Actually, let me show you one more thing. And then I want to talk about how it's going to apply in your own life. So, I thought about doing this. I guess I normally don't do this, but I want to show you this. I want to introduce you to the man you would have met if you would have met me 14 years ago around this measure, interrupt, replace thing. So back then, I had a completely different posture. In those days, my shoulders were kind of hunched inwards, and my chest was concave. So now I stand here, I was sort of punched over. But the really different thing is my breath. I was actually breathing shallowly. I breathed sort of up here, and my breath was very, very rapid. And so I don't know if any of you notice it, but it's like, there's sort of a different feeling when you're sort of talking to me. And you can imagine, like, if I went up to an investor, which I did, and I said, I want to get like $1 million investment into my company, I mean, how would you respond? Would you trust this? By comparison, when you just retrain yourself and you unfurl your shoulders, and you sort of deepen your breath and put your energy outward, who here notices a difference between the man standing in front of you now and the one you would have met? Right. So I want to now begin an investigation into the question of how we can use this measure, interrupt, and replace process in your life. Actually, I want to tell you one more thing. Because remember I said, there's all this sort of Terminator kind of stuff. I'm going to tell you two things, which are just examples of where we're using it kind of in the extreme, and then we're going to go back and talk about it. Okay? So it turns out if you take a digital camera and you feed information from that camera onto the tongue of someone who's blind, someone who's born blind, take the information, you feed it onto their tongue, and then you make them operate as if they could see, sort of like trying to pick up a magic marker. Over the course of 30 days, what you're going to see is you're going to see the development of a neural pathway from the tip of their tongue into their visual cortex. And for the first time in their life, they will begin to form three-dimensional color images in their brain. True. They will begin to say. Measure, interrupt, replace. I'll tell you something even more crazy. I was just at MIT 2 days ago. 6 months ago at MIT, they took mice, and they had them go through a maze. And as they were learning the maze, They recorded electrical signals in an area called the hippocampus of the mice. Recorded those signals, put them on a microchip, took the microchip, inserted it into the brain of a mouse who had never been inside the maze. What does that other mouse now know how to do? They know how to run the maze. Have any of you ever been in a relationship? So what would you want to put on that microchip if you could put that in the brain of your... So this is really cool stuff, but let's talk about how you can use measure, interrupt, and replace in your own life. Let's begin and talk about measurement. The first step in rewiring, this is how I started, this is how anyone starts, has to be with measurement and monitoring. And let me set this up, and then I want to start engaging with you and thinking about how you can apply it in your own life. Remember, I said, it's your unconscious mind which is hurting your effectiveness. Either these wars with the conscious mind or the unconscious mind, which is having no impact. You simply cannot do anything about that until you become aware of it. You know, I told you changing the temperature in the room is going to have an impact. I don't know how many of you are going to do anything about it, but if you actually watch the impact and you start to measure it, you're going to do it. Because you're going to say, oh my goodness, this little simple thing has such a huge impact. So what we need to do as our first step is we need to dissect out what the triggers are unconsciously that are affecting our performance, and we begin to measure them. We can rewire it quite easily with the interrupt and replace. But the first thing is the measurement and monitoring. And so I'd like to ask you now to think through a question with me, and it's not a trivial question. And I'm not sure how to phrase this to make it easy, and I apologize for that, but here it is. What's something about your life which varies a lot, but you act like it doesn't? Sort of like cognitive function or energy levels. Because what I want to do is I want to identify something where if you were to start to manage it and optimize it, your life would change. And I'll tell you something. I've never seen a situation where somebody picks out a factor and starts to measure it where you don't see essentially a doubling in effectiveness from doing it. Because you're just becoming conscious of that which was unconscious. So start to brainstorm with me, and let's think about what are the things that you'd love to become more aware of and optimize in terms of how you perform. Energy or cognition or whatever. And again, just any ideas. And, you know, we're sort of all, yes?
Spikes in stress level.
Stress level. Can anyone else relate to this? Right. Your ability to have good cognition when you're under stress is incredibly poor. You're susceptible to far more disease than otherwise, and in fact, your ability to keep your mind focused. Now, interestingly, you sort of want to have like a little bit of stress, but finding that place where you're overloaded is really a problem. And I want to tell you, in the world of stress, and there's a lot of study in this, almost everybody's functioning like these Israeli judges, just massive overload. You know, essentially, we're all running around in chronic fight or flight states, and our ability to function there is massively below it. Right. Now, when I measure stress, I do it with sensors. Right? Because what you can do is you can measure something called heart rate variability, or you can measure something that used to be called galvanic skin response, which is what they do as a lie detector. Either of those are pure physiological measures of stress, but you can measure it subjectively as well. So let me ask you, what if you did the same thing that this billionaire did, if stress is an issue, and started to just measure how are you every hour or every day in terms of your stress level, and started to pay attention to what's making you stressed or not? What would that do to your life? And again, here's what I want to say. The thing that's really hard in terms of sort of doing my job and convincing people about stuff is this doesn't sound that hard. Because there's no willpower involved. You're just writing down a number. But the fact is, what you're doing is you're playing with your unconscious mind, and you manage what you measure. So if you suffer from stress, what I'm telling you is, if you do nothing, forget the interrupt and replace, which we'll get to in a moment, if you do nothing other than simply measure stress levels, same as this gentleman who measured productivity, you're going to see radical changes in your life, right? I'm going to give you one more example, and then let's talk about something else. You have all heard that the best proven system for losing weight is to start tracking what you eat. Who's heard this? Right? It's incredibly well demonstrated. It's essentially measurement, right? Essentially, you're engaging the conscious mind and eliminating unconscious eating. Okay, so stress, I think, is a terrific one, and that's something I spent a lot of time measuring in myself and trying to figure out how to change it, and believe it or not, I'm a lot less stressed than I used to be. Anything else that strikes you as here? Yes?
How about mood?
Mood. So tell me more.
Happy, sad, frustrated, angry.
Happy, sad, frustrated, angry. It's funny, the lab that I was in MIT was studying exactly that. What they're doing is they're doing a study of MIT students and trying to predict when they're going to be happy or not. And it turns out the computer can pretty much tell you how happy a student is going to be the next morning just by gathering physiology. You know what the number one predictor is, by the way, of whether a student is going to be happy the next morning?
Alcohol.
I'm going to tell you something interesting. Is alcohol positively or negatively correlated? If you drink the night before, are you happier or less sad in the next morning?
I would say negatively.
No, it actually turns out they're very unhappy about this. But it turns out, it's not a strong correlation, but it turns out that with a p-value of about 15%, people who drank the night before are happier the next morning. They presented it and they were like, we wish this wasn't the case, we can't explain it, but it's true.
Who you drank with, too.
That's one of the two factors. It's exactly right. Well, he said who you drank with. Human contact with people you liked the night before is one of the two top predictors of whether or not someone is going to be happy, right? That alone explains 40% of whether someone's going to be happy. This has nothing to do with my talk, by the way, but it was just so cool and interesting. What do you think the other thing is, which has a 40% predictive value? Now remember, they're just like looking at data. You're not going to guess this because you wouldn't know. It's the number of hours that they were on their phone the prior night. Turns out the more time you spend on your phone, the less happy you're going to be in the morning, with huge predictive value.
You said that to my daughter.
Well, it's funny, you know. This goes back to the people have no idea, right? This is the unconscious of what you're going to be unconscious about. This is the science I live in. Now, I have absolutely no idea what I was talking about, but it was just so yes.
So, sorry to interrupt, but...
No, it's okay. We're already so far off. Like,
okay.
I don't even remember what I was talking
So
about.
that sounded contradictory to me because you're saying social context, drinking and being socially engaged is a positive predictor for happiness. And then if I heard you correctly, time on the cell phone is...
Looking at your phone.
Or
Time looking on your phone.
looking on the phone, not talking.
Right, it's the number of hours. What you do is, with the iPhone, you can track, well, they actually do it on an Android, but with any phone, you can track the number of hours that the phone is on and they're looking at the screen. So the more time they spend...
It wasn't talking on the phone, it was using a computer.
These are, they don't, I don't know if you know this, but they don't actually talk on the phone. But they will text, and texting does not make you happier. It's live contact in positive situations. Fascinating. Nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Yes, sir.
It's the case that more time looking at the phone makes you less happy, but it's not like if you cut back the hours, it doesn't make you happier. It just reaches a certain point of neutrality.
Well,
You understand what
I'm going to dive into the weeds here for a second. There's a saying in science which is correlation doesn't equal causation. Like, they're not pretending that they know what causes them. They just know that they can predict it. My own theory is if a kid's sitting alone in their room and they're spending all the time on the phone, they're probably already unhappy, so it's a predictor of that. But what I do know is that the people who spend time with their friends are generally happier than the ones not. But a kid who, on a Monday is on their phone and on a Tuesday with their friends, the next morning their mood will be different. So it's a very strong predictor. It's interesting. It doesn't mean I don't know. I don't know what it means. So what we were talking about is what you can measure. And so, the first thing we identified was stress, and then we got to mood, which is what completely threw me off. And that's exactly, there's an entire lab at MIT which studies nothing other than mood and the impact that it has on people, right? Yes?
Does a word that probably most people in here have experience with, procrastination?
Procrastination, sure.
Belong on that word or not?
Yeah, no, procrastination is great. The Microsoft guy just left. There's an app that you can get on Windows which tracks your activity, where it'll just give you a report on how much time you spend wasting time on the internet or the phone, you know. But yeah, well, it's you know, let's call it time wasting. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, was that on Mac as well or no?
No, it's not on Mac. Dude, this is Microsoft we're talking about, right? They
What was that three-letter word?
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Microsoft is very proud. The last presentation Tim had was that they understand the marketplace, so everything they're developing is supposed to be using a plethora of platforms.
Plethora of platforms. Yes. But, you know, Apple is not offering this. So let's start. I want to, you know, I know we're all over the place. Measure, interrupt, and replace. So if you want to enhance your effectiveness in the world, the first thing I want you to do is to start thinking about what are the unconscious behaviors that I have where I can start becoming conscious of them and tracking them. And if, like my friend, once an hour or once a day, you simply write down a number on how happy you were or how unhappy you were, how stressed you were or how unstressed you were, how effective you were, how productive you were with your time, that alone will engender massive changes. The only problem is you won't be aware of it because you'll still be unconscious of it. But it's going to have a huge impact. And this is a lot of what I've done. Remember the measurement thing. And I find, I mean, I work with professional athletes, I work with CEOs. It's ridiculous. And time wasting, by the way, there's now been 50 years of study where you take CEOs and you measure their time. The vast majority of the time is being spent poorly. But once you become aware of it, you start to see where your time is wasted. And it's amazing. So if you simply were to measure these three things on, let's say, a twice-a-day basis, ladies and gentlemen, your life would change completely. Simply because you're engaging the frontal part of your brain and you're interrupting these unconscious pathways. Yes?
Could I also take a positive spin? Of course, coming from a little bit of a coaching background.
Yes.
There's also science behind the positive. People that keep and maintain a gratitude journal. If before you go to bed at night, you write down 25 things you are grateful for. I'm so grateful for the chocolate brownie. I'm the most minuscule thing. I'm grateful for my family. That you actually start to attract more, which is where the whole law of attraction is, the positive thoughts.
Right. So
instead of measuring your stress, I hope we encourage people to measure the positive things, to be aware of.
yes. Well, this is the interrupt and replace piece, and that's exactly right. You keep a gratitude journal, you will be more grateful, and I'll talk about the neurology of it. But what I do want to start with is the measurement. Now, it's true, in general, it's better to measure how calm was I versus how stressed was I because you've got the focus on it. But the fact is, 90% of the value is simply becoming aware of it. 10% of the value is, am I focusing on the positive or negative? The truth is, if you just notice if you're being grateful or not, that's going to make a lot more difference than am I being grateful or am I being ungrateful? Either way, your brain is going to now engage your frontal cortex. And again, we'll talk about the interrupt and replace because again, you can completely change your life with this triad. Yes, yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the guy who set his phone for every hour,
Yes.
all right, and then he measured.
He said, yeah.
All right. First of all, I want you to just repeat what the person did, or what you asked him to do. But the other piece was that by having the phone interrupt you, you're actually not doing measure, interrupt, and replace. You're doing interrupt, measure, and then replace.
Yes. These are not okay, so let me speak to both of these. I don't know if everybody heard this. I'm going to repeat first the process. So what he did is he set his iPhone for 2 weeks, every hour while he was at work, it goes off, writes down a number on a scale of 1 to 10 about how productive he was. You could do that with stress or mood or time wasting. And then just wrote down some notes around how productive he thought he had been and what he noticed about what was working or not. Right? And so yes, it's true, you interrupt before you measure, but it doesn't matter. The point is to do the three of them. Yes. But now I want to talk about the interrupt pattern. So we've now talked about this notion, you manage what you measure. And so if you identify something, you can change it. What interrupt means is that you simply take whatever behavior you're doing and you stop it over and over and over again until the neural pathway dissolves. Now, this is not, in fact, the use of willpower. It's something different. And I'll tell you a story. I have a friend named Tucker Taylor, who's one of the, I just like it because I like his name. He's one of the founders of Federal Express. And I told him about this. This was 3 months ago. And he had this problem called restless leg syndrome. I don't know if you've ever seen this. His leg just shook, and it's been bothering him since he was 2 years old. I was there with the head of neurology from Columbia, and we had a discussion about how can you stop it, and it turns out it's very easy, which is go for 30 days and don't allow your leg to shake. Use your will and just don't let your leg shake. 30 days later, his restless leg syndrome was completely cured. We see this over and over because what's happening is you interrupt a pathway long enough, the neural pathway will simply dissolve. I'm going to tell you one more story because I want you to think about how this is going to apply. I was talking earlier about how this is used in psychiatry. So one of the ways in which it's been able to be extraordinary is obsessive compulsive disorder. We all have it to sort of a minor degree, but the people who are really extreme, it just destroys their life. Right? They touch something, they think they're covered in germs, they wash their hands. That's all they do is they just keep going back and washing their hands. If you take someone with OCD and you put them in a lab, and every time they want to wash their hands, you say, oh, you're not allowed to wash your hands. Instead, I want you to turn on music and dance. These people when I went to medical school, we were told it's incurable. Within 30 days, 80% of them are completely cured. And if you look at their brains, the pathway dissolves. Because you're forcing the interruption, and by the way, you're replacing. Right?
Substitution.
It's a substitution, right.
So they dance more?
Well, the dancing, yes, they dance more and they're happier. But I mean, essentially what's happening is you're forcing the brain to measure it, to notice it's happening, to stop it, and then simply replace it with another pathway. And then when you do that, you're cured. You can fix dietary problems. I'm very grateful to say, I talked about this in Ohio 2 months ago with a guy who's now, that means I've got 10 minutes. Okay, I have one more question, then I'd like to close. Yeah.
How does that apply to addiction?
It's a great question. How does it apply to addiction? Unfortunately, this has not been able to work well with addiction because the chemicals themselves kind of overcome the neurology here. And so there's a lot of research in the addiction field, but when you've got chemicals to which you're addicted, to date, there's been very little progress. Obviously, everybody wants to use this for heroin or alcohol or whatever. It works for food, but once you get into more hard drugs, it's hard. So I got the 10-minute thing. I want to just close by sharing a little bit about my institute and the research we're doing and sort of what the promise is. Because you may think this is cool and maybe you can double or quadruple productivity. But I'm here to assert to you that this rewiring science is going to utterly change the game. And so for these last 10 minutes, let's talk about how the science we're talking about is going to actually fundamentally change the game in the world of business. And to start this off, when we think about improving our lives, we'll typically focus on one of two areas. And I'll illustrate it graphically. One of them is productivity, which we talked about. And then one is sort of fulfillment, right? How happy you are. We probably all know some people who are kind of out here on the graph, very productive, not the happiest, right? Perhaps some of you know people like I do who are kind of up here, who are very happy, maybe not the most productive members of society, right? Let me ask you a question. Where kind of in, the sort of optimal world would you want to be on this graph? Upper right, obviously. But now let me ask you, where kind of are you most of the time? In the middle. I think most people say that. So here's my question to you. What if we could take a snapshot of what's going on inside your brain and your body when you're here and just rewire you using this measure, interrupt, and replace things so that becomes your home. How would that change your life? So a year ago, and this is bringing you to my research, a colleague of mine did a 2-week study on himself looking at his own effectiveness at work. And the first thing he did is he actually measured where he is on this graph. And it turned out sort of like you would expect. Most of the time, he's a senior executive at a tech firm, which is a competitor to Microsoft. Most of the time he was here, it was sort of like a 6 and a 6. But during this 2-week period, there were actually 3 hours where kind of unexpectedly he found himself up here in the top right. A 10 and a 10. And it turned out that during 2 of those 3 hours, he was running a meeting there where they came up with a new idea that no one in the company had ever thought of before. And subsequently, that's been about a year, that idea has now generated over $80 million of profit to the company. So I would call that productive, like $40 million an hour productive. And he was happy. Now you got to picture this. He was walking around his office during these 2 weeks wearing 5 monitors, right? So he's looking at his brainwaves, he's looking at his heart rate variability, we're just checking his blood chemistry every hour. Here's what I want to tell you. During the 3 hours that my friend, I'm going to call him Vince, was up here, from a neurophysiological perspective, he was a completely different guy than he was here. Completely different brainwaves, completely different blood chemistry. In fact, his brainwaves looked a lot like the same brainwaves you would see in a monk. And subsequently, using measure, interrupt, and replace, he's essentially been able to rewire himself so at will he can access that place. I mean, have you ever had a moment like this where kind of you sort of suddenly enter a bliss state and all of a sudden, it's sort of like you can see around corners, your productivity goes through the roof and it's just like everything flows? So the promise, the opportunity of rewiring science and what I study is the possibility of decoding what's going on with you in those moments where you are just crushing it and rewiring yourself so that becomes accessible at will. Now, that's the promise of the Platypus Institute. That's my hope for each and every one of you. So thank you. So I guess you're supposed to go and drink now.
With friends.
With friends.
You have 5 minutes for Q&A. Does anyone have any questions?
There's more Q&A. Oh, okay. Great. And I thought I was done. Yes.
Is that upper right dot the same state as when you're in the flow state?
That is a flow state. Yeah, he was in a classic flow state. Let me just tell you just briefly. The main thing that you see is a change in the brainwave. So you see this kind of monk-like thing. The front part of his brain, it's interesting. The part of your brain where you think, it just turned off. So you see a diminishment in cortical activity in the frontal cortex where you think, and the rest of his brain just slowed down. It was these slow, coordinated alpha and theta waves. Same thing you see in a monk. It's really bizarre.
Because you lose track of time.
You have no awareness of time. You lose track of yourself. You simply merge with the environment. But I'll tell you something interesting. We talked about stress. His stress levels were just so relaxed, like deep breath, completely relaxed body. You see the same thing in athletics, right? In those moments where people like just keep hitting the basket, their body, except for their fingers, is just totally relaxed. So yeah, he found a flow state. I mean, essentially that's what we're decoding. It's very interesting. And change the lighting, change the temperature in the room, that's clues to access it. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I missed this, but okay, so once he had that flow state and you happened to measure it, how did he then start to live there? How did he get there?
Oh, that's easy. No, it's great.
Tell me everything.
Okay, it's very simple. Let's say that you know your brainwave pattern when you're in a flow state or not, okay? You can do biofeedback and train yourself to get that brainwave pattern. Right, so remember I said I spent a week in a biofeedback chamber? I can triple my alpha wave activity like that fast. I can increase my theta wave activity. I can make my brain waves go here or there. It's like learning to ride a bicycle.
Yeah, you know
Simple.
what? I'm
What?
getting neurofeedback done right now, and it's awesome. It's amazing. I'm
And what are you working? What are you getting the feedback on?
I'm actually
What are they training you to do?
I'll just tell all of you. I'm actually getting rid of ADHD.
Okay.
I'm actually curing my brain.
But do you know specifically what you're learning to do in your brain?
I know that I'm switching between using two different parts of my brain. I know it has to do with theta waves, but I don't know.
Okay. So.
It's neurofeedback and it's HEG.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So basically, what's happening is she's got ADHD, but it turns out.
Not anymore.
She. You're like an alcoholic. You can never not have ADHD. She used to have a lot of it, but here's what I want to share with you, and this goes to the unconscious. She doesn't either have ADHD or not. Sometimes she's got a brain pattern which she's like that in, and sometimes she's not. Remember this guy? So she's got two patterns. All she's doing is training her brain so when she wants to, she can go to here. That's what he's doing, right? We've got like 5 things. Train the brain waves, train the body relaxation. It's really like learning to ride a bike. The key thing is measurement. Once you know what it is, interrupt and replace is a very trivial thing to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not complicated. I mean, you can learn to be in a flow state. It's just, what do I look like? And then train myself. And you can do it in like 3 months. Yeah.
Can you talk about the replace thing, that executive, what did he do?
The replace.
Yeah, what was
Well,
his
his replace. So the question is, can I talk about the replace thing? Remember, this wasn't like a science experiment, right? This was like I had 5 minutes to like try to make a good impression on the dude. He didn't do replace the natural way that you would think about it. But if you write down notes about what you noticed in the prior hour about what was productive or not, what's going to happen is you're going to start to change your behavior. So he'll interrupt at the end and then measure, because again, he's got the IMR thing, right? It's not the MIR, but he's got the interrupt, measure, and replace. When you say, this worked well, this didn't work well, the next hour he's going to do the thing that worked well and not the one that didn't work well, right? But it's not anything like my friend, Tucker, or the OCD thing where it's like, I want to wash my hands, I dance.
Right.
But I didn't get to put the guy in a laboratory. If I would have, I could have tripled his productivity. Really, yeah.
So in emotional intelligence, they talk about being able to rewire your brain, create new neural pathways, so on and so forth. And
Right.
it's making a choice about behavior. And that's where I was talking about, choose a substitute behavior instead of,
Right.
reacting the way that you might otherwise. So, do you have any comment on that? How this relates to something like emotional intelligence and creating those new neural pathways?
Sure. So the question is, how does this relate to the notion of cultivating emotional intelligence? I've got to tell you a story. I don't give a lot of talks, but I gave a talk 2 months ago in Baltimore. And I wanted to show people how they have like different states. This was such a surreal experience. So this one woman comes up and she says, I want to train myself so I can maintain my composure around my daughter. Right? This is sort of very calm. She meditates all the time, but she gets around her daughter, who's like 13 years old, and like the daughter was, I guess maybe 1 or 2 of you can relate to this. I've never heard about this with teenage daughters, but apparently. So I put her up on the stage and I say, okay, that's fine. So she stands up here and then I pull up some other woman from the audience to pretend to be her daughter. By the way, who doesn't look at all like her, this tall, black model-looking woman who's pretending to be her daughter only she's a lot taller. And she says, so what's the scenario, right? And so it's like, she said she got a message, but she didn't, and she wasn't coming home from the mall or something, right? And so what happens with your daughter? And so this woman is standing there, and the daughter's standing, and she starts screaming at her daughter, right? Like yelling at her, and the black woman is standing over here, and she starts yelling back. And she's, I didn't get the text from you. It's like, somehow it's like we tapped into her childhood, and then she started fighting. And I said, that's great. Okay, stop. They wouldn't stop. They were yelling. I had to walk in between them and make them stop, right? This is about emotional intelligence. She wasn't particularly emotionally intelligent. So then I say to this woman here, I say, okay, have you ever had a moment with your daughter where you're not angry at her? Like ever? She had to think. She was like, it's like, yeah, 2 years ago, There was right this time. So close your eyes, pretend you're there. What happened to you? So we're sitting there in the audience, and her whole body shifts, right? Her shoulders went back, her breath calmed down, and you could see like this love coming at her from the daughter. And that's great. Did everybody see the shift? Everybody's like, oh my God, that's huge. Like, now maintain that state, and I want you to yell at your daughter. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't yell at her daughter unless she went back like this. And it was such a deeply ingrained pattern when she was in that one posture, we couldn't stop her. So let's talk about measure, interrupt, and replace. What that woman needs to simply become aware of is those two states. The I'm angry at my daughter, I'm relaxed. Measure that, interrupt, and train her body to be like this. The problems with the daughter go away. I mean, you think that sounds silly, but that's exactly what I did. It's an absolutely doable phenomenon. So what I would say about emotional intelligence is, there's all sorts of psychological stuff, but in terms of your neurophysiology, you put yourself into the correct neurophysiological state, you simply have emotional intelligence. You become aware of the room, you find yourself feeling love because of how you're breathing, because of how your brainwaves work. That's my gig. I'm not saying anything else is wrong, but it's a crazy powerful way of doing it. Does everybody relate to this?
Yeah. It does start with the awareness.
It starts with the awareness. And I would say, if you take a look, for example, at how you guys are sitting, how your posture is, if you changed your seating and your posture, your entire experience of me would change.
We have time for one more question.
One more question, yes.
So the short version is there an app for this? but more seriously, what are your plans to get this to the masses in a very compact, snackable way that has massive impact?
Well, I'll tell you the simplest thing. Out in that room, kind of at the registration table, there's this tiny little bowl where there's a sign and it says, drop your card here and sign up for our newsletter and podcast and stuff. So the first thing I can offer you is I release a newsletter every week. I got a newsletter every 2 weeks, a podcast every week. I interview the coolest people. I mean, I interview people I think are cool, So, I interview people like who can withstand extreme cold and scientists who study sleep and, just all talking about this. So if you sign up for that, you'll keep abreast of the latest news in this rewiring thing. I hope that a year from now we're going to have something which is kind of broadly available. Right now it takes a lot of work to work with one person. That's part of the reason I'm talking to just share the principles. There's a lot of apps you can use to measure things, though. This is not a new thing. And stay in touch with me, and my prayer is that a year from now I'll actually have something that I can offer you. I've not done a TED Talk. I'm writing a book. I keep getting all this stuff. Yeah, I've just started. I'll be out there. Yeah.